A lioness stepped out of the forest, not with teeth bared or claws raised, but with something far more powerful in her jaws. She carried a cub, barely breathing. She didn't run, she didn't roar. She laid the dying cub on a stranger's porch, then looked him in the eyes, as if to say, "You're the only one I trust." But how did she know? And why did the little girl inside the cabin, who hadn't spoken in years, start whispering again that very night? What happened next would change 3 lives forever. Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments, and if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you? Please give this video a like and consider subscribing. The first light of an autumn morning slipped quietly between the pines of Bridger Teton National Forest, painting the forest floor in shades of golden rust. A brittle chill hung in the air, the kind that made each breath visible, and frost glazed the porch rails of the old cabin nestled at the edge of the tree line. The world was hushed, save for the distant crackle of falling leaves and the low murmur of a creek half frozen by the shifting season. Inside the cabin, Theodore Clark stirred his coffee with a spoon carved from bone, the steam rising gently before it faded into the beams of sunlight cutting through the kitchen window. Theo was 68 tall but slightly hunched from decades spent in the field. His skin bore the leathery creases of sun and time, and his silver-gray beard covered a face that had seen more loss than he ever voiced. A retired wildlife rescuer, Theo had once run with tranquilizer darts, nursed orphaned cubs, and stared into the eyes of animals more human than many men. But that was another life before his wife passed, and before the accident that took his daughter and son-in-law, leaving only a frightened child and the sound of his own guilt. That child was Ava Clark, now 11, thin, pale, and often silent. Ava moved like a shadow in the house, present, but always at a distance. Her long brown hair was usually tied back in a low ponytail, and her oversized hoodie draped like a curtain between her and the world, since the accident 2 years ago. She hadn't spoken more than a handful of words, and never in public. Only Theo had glimpsed the vibrant, clever girl she had been, now buried beneath layers of silence and trauma. Theo turned from the stove and peeked toward the window, expecting nothing more than the usual morning stillness. But what he saw made his hand freeze mid-air. At the end of the gravel path, less than 30 feet from the front porch, stood something out of place, out of time, a lion, not a mountain lion, which he might expect this far north, but a full-grown, golden-coated African lioness. Her muscles rippled beneath her fur with every breath. She stood tall, unshaken, with eyes not wild with fear or rage, but focused, steady, and full of intention. But that wasn't the only thing that made Theo's chest tighten. Cradled gently in her jaws was a cub, no, more than one, at her feet. Nestled in the dry, frost-dusted grass were 3 lion cubs, their spotted coats mottled with dirt and leaves. One of them twitched and curled up beside her paw. But another wasn't moving at all. Theo set the mug down and moved toward the door, his breath catching. "Ava," he said, voice low. "Come here." Slowly, from the hallway, Ava appeared, her wide eyes already asking what he hadn't said. She padded toward the front window, hugged her arms to herself, and looked through the glass. Her lips parted just slightly, and though she didn't speak, she didn't move away either. Her gaze locked with the lioness's. Theo opened the front door just enough to step out onto the porch, his boots creaking against the frost-hardened wood. The lioness's head turned, her gaze narrowing. Theo raised his hands slowly, palms outward, like he was speaking an ancient language only they both remembered. The lioness didn't move, no growl, no step forward. Instead, she lowered her head, and in a motion so deliberate it stunned him. She gently placed the unmoving cub at the edge of the porch, then stepped back 3 paces. Theo knelt cautiously. The cub was small, too small, and its chest barely rose with breath. It was feverish to the touch, eyes closed, legs limp. He could see signs of dehydration, and possibly an infection near its belly. The other 2 cubs huddled near their mother. Trembling slightly, he turned his head back toward the door. "Ava," he called softly, "bring the emergency blanket, the blue one from the hallway." Ava hesitated, then disappeared into the cabin. The lioness, meanwhile, remained rooted in place. Her golden eyes scanned every move Theo made, but not with threat. There was something else in them, an echo of something ancient, something sacred. Trust, perhaps, or memory. When Ava returned with the blanket clutched in her arms, she paused just inside the doorway, unsure. Theo nodded. "Come here, sweetheart, slow." Ava stepped onto the porch. 1 step, then 2. The lioness's gaze shifted, now watching Ava, but Ava didn't run. She crouched beside her grandfather and held out the blanket. Then, almost instinctively, she glanced at the lioness and whispered, barely audible, but her first full sentence in months, "She's not here to hurt us." Theo didn't flinch. He wrapped the cub gently and lifted it in his arms. The cub stirred, weakly, letting out the faintest mewl. Inside the cabin, the heater was already humming. Theo cleared a space on the couch and laid the cub down atop a thick wool towel. Ava hovered nearby, her eyes still flicking to the window, where the lioness remained, still, watchful, unmoving. "She's not leaving," Ava whispered again, pressing her forehead to the glass. And Theo, heart pounding with a mixture of awe and urgency, knew that whatever brought this lioness here wasn't random. It was something that began long before this morning. Something buried in a past he thought he'd left behind. The morning passed in a hush of breath and quiet motion. Theo stood near the window, arms crossed, watching the lioness through the frosted glass. She hadn't moved from her spot, still crouched low near the porch, her eyes fixed on the door. The 2 healthy cubs nuzzled into her side, while the third remained curled in Theo's old flannel blanket on the couch inside. There was something in the way she watched him, intense, unwavering, not feral, but familiar. Theo turned slowly, glancing at the cub. Its breathing had steadied, but it was still too weak. He knew he had to get help fast. The nearest wildlife medical station was small, but they had the tools to scan chips and track animal data. He wrapped the cub carefully, placed it in the back seat of his pickup truck, and drove. The winding road cut through the heart of Bridger Teton's early autumn woods, the colors vibrant but the air tense as he drove. Theo's mind kept circling one impossible thought. The lioness. She looked familiar, the way she stood, the way she tilted her head, the shape of a small scar above her brow. It stirred something in his memory, like a voice calling from far away. 2 hours later, at the modest wildlife station tucked at the edge of Wilson, Wyoming. A technician scanned the cub for a microchip. Theo stood silent, breath tight. A faint beep broke the silence. The technician blinked. "Found something. Cub is registered to Wild River Conservation." Theo stepped forward, his voice rough. "Is there a maternal link?" The technician tapped the screen. "Yeah, mother ID. Savannah." Theo's heart slammed against his ribs. Savannah, 12 years ago. She had come into his life as an abandoned cub, half-starved. covered in ticks, and with a bad leg wound. She had been a mess of bones and trembles. And Theo, then still working full-time at Wild River, had spent nearly a year raising her. She had followed his voice, leaned into his side during thunderstorms, and learned to trust again. He had named her after the homeland she would never see, Savannah. After her recovery, she'd been released into the Northern Preserve, and her chip last registered a year later near the Yellowstone border. Then, nothing. Most assumed she hadn't survived. But now, she was here, older, larger, with cubs of her own, and somehow, when the wild failed her, she remembered not just the place, she remembered him, back at the cabin. Ava sat cross-legged by the low living room table. Her sketch pad lay open, a pencil gripped tightly in her hand. Since Theo had left with the cub, she hadn't said a word, but her hands hadn't stopped moving. She had drawn the lioness once, then again, first from the porch, then from memory, the curve of the back, the heavy paws, the golden eyes, but more than anatomy. There was something deeper in the lines she carved, a strange, intuitive softness, a knowing. Ava had always been a quiet child, since the accident. She'd spoken only in whispers, and even then rarely. But today, she drew with focus, with intention, as if something in the lioness's gaze had cracked a door she'd long kept closed. She turned to a clean page, began again. Each sketch captured more than what she'd seen. It captured what she felt. Something wordless, something ancient, something shared. The wind had changed. It came colder now, sweeping through the tall evergreens that lined the clearing around Theo's cabin. The leaves had begun their silent fall, amber and rust dancing through the sky before sinking to the damp earth. A light mist hung over the pine canopy, and from the porch where Theo stood with a hand wrapped around his old coffee mug, the world looked both quieter and heavier than before. Across the clearing, barely visible in the gray dawn light, lay Savannah. She had not moved since the day before. She rested just beyond the porch, beneath the low arc of a pine tree, her body curled protectively around her two remaining cubs. The one that had been taken for treatment, the weakest, was still absent, and yet she waited. Not pacing, not roaring, just present. Theo knew this kind of waiting. He'd seen it in mothers before, animal and human. But what unsettled him now was the silence, not fear, not threat, stillness, and grief inside the cabin. Ava had risen early. She hadn't said much, she rarely did, but when she entered the room that morning, there was a shift in her, a softness in her walk, a little less hesitancy in her steps. She went to the table without being told and opened her sketch pad. The light from the wood-burning stove caught in her brown hair as she tucked a loose strand behind one ear. She flipped past yesterday's drawings. Savannah curled in frost. Savannah with tired eyes, and stopped on a fresh page, this time. She didn't just draw the lioness. She drew her beside the cabin and beside Savannah. She drew a girl, not entirely like Ava, but not unlike her either, smaller, braver, standing closer. Theo noticed but didn't interrupt. He knew better than to question these moments. Later that morning, he drove back to the Teton Wildlife Medical Center, his heart pounding with cautious hope. The cub had been left in the care of Dr. Benjamin Rhodes, a wiry man in his early 50s with wild graying curls and a constantly furrowed brow. Ben was known for being skeptical, serious, and borderline obsessive when it came to his patients. His hands were always stained with iodine, and his white coat was permanently wrinkled no matter how often he ironed it. He wasn't warm, but he was good. Theo found him in the observation room, sitting beside the incubator with the lion cub inside. The little creature's chest was rising with more regularity now, and the pale inflammation around its ribs had dulled. He made it through the night, Ben said gruffly without looking up. Still weak, but he's got fight in him. Theo exhaled, long and slow. That's something. Ben finally turned. His eyes narrowed. That Lioness of yours, the one who dropped him off, you're sure she hasn't left? Still there? Ben scratched the side of his nose. You know, she might not take him back. Right. The cub's covered in human scent. Antibiotics. Latex. We've interfered. Theo's jaw clenched. She brought him to us. Ben didn't argue. They both knew it was more than instinct that led Savannah here, but science, for all its miracles, remained skeptical of things like memory, trust, and something deeper. Choice, back at the cabin. The quiet wasn't oppressive anymore. Ava had taken to sitting on the steps outside, wrapped in a red wool blanket. Savannah never came closer, but she always watched her that evening. As the sun dropped behind the hills, Ava stayed a little longer, leaning her head against the porch post. Theo stepped outside beside her. Cold Ava shook her head. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't ask for conversation. Then Ava's voice came, small but sure. She growled last night. Theo turned his head. Savannah. Ava nodded. When the wind picked up, it wasn't loud, it was soft. I heard it through the window. He didn't speak, just let her continue. It was deep, like thunder far away, but not scary. She looked toward the tree line. It made me feel like someone was guarding the house. Theo swallowed the lump in his throat. She is. Ava leaned her head against his arm, and for the first time in what felt like years, Theo let out a sigh that wasn't heavy. That night. Ava slept through the storm, no night terrors, no midnight pacing, just a steady rise and fall of breath beneath her covers. In the morning, she showed Theo another drawing. This one was of Savannah lying beneath the pine tree, but now the cubs were 4, not 3, and one of them was curled up beside a young girl in a red blanket. The sun had returned after 3 days of quiet drizzle, and the earth smelled of pine needles and renewal. The sky above Bridger Teton had softened into a deep Wyoming blue, with scattered clouds that drifted like thoughts not yet spoken. The air was cool but generous, filled with bird song and the distant rustling of elk moving through the trees. For the first time in a long while, the forest felt alive, not wild, not dangerous, but watching. In the small clearing near Theo's cabin, Savannah lay stretched across the flattened grass, her 2 cubs curled along her flank. Her gaze still lingered toward the porch, always waiting, always listening. She had not left. Not for food, not for shelter. She had stayed for the one who was missing. Inside the cabin, Ava stood at the sink, rinsing her paintbrushes in a chipped mason jar. Her sketchpad lay open on the table behind her, pages fluttering in the morning breeze. Her latest drawing was different from the others. It wasn't of Savannah this time, it was of the cub. She'd drawn him, returning, and beside him. Savannah's eyes no longer sad, but whole. Theo entered through the back door, coat draped over his arm. His movements were quicker today, less burdened. Hope had a way of moving through his bones now, even if cautiously. He looked toward Ava and smiled. They just called. He said, "He's ready." Ava turned, wide-eyed. The vet said he's strong enough for the trip. Theo continued, softening his tone. "We can bring him home." Ava set the brush down, slowly, her fingers trembling not from fear but anticipation. 3 hours later. Theo pulled the pickup into the driveway, in the bed of the truck. inside a soft crate lined with flannel and straw. The cub stirred, blinking at the sunlight. His breathing was steady now. The infection had cleared. His eyes, once cloudy with fever, now glistened with quiet alertness. Beside Theo in the passenger seat was Jillian Oakes, a wildlife transfer specialist assigned to help with reintroductions. Jillian was in her late 30s, tall and sharply built, with short-cropped black hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. She wore a utility vest lined with tranquilizer darts and GPS trackers, but she spoke with a gentleness that surprised most people who met her. Jillian had grown up in Montana, raised by a grandfather who taught her to track wolves by their scent and listen to trees when they shifted in the wind. She didn't believe in luck, but she did believe in patterns, and today, something about this moment felt aligned. Theo parked near the cabin. Savannah rose instantly, eyes narrowing, body still. Her muscles didn't tense the way they would before a charge. It was something else, a knowing. Theo stepped out slowly. Ava, wrapped in her red blanket, moved beside him, her fingers brushing the edge of the crate. Jillian walked to the back and gently opened the latches. "Let's give them space," she said, voice low. Theo nodded and carefully lifted the cub out. He was heavier now, solid, warm. The cub let out a soft mew. Then another, louder this time. Savannah's head snapped toward the sound. Her body stiffened, then relaxed, and then she moved, first one paw forward, then another. Her steps were slow, deliberate. The other two cubs stirred but did not follow. Savannah walked until she stood just 10 feet away from Theo. Theo gently lowered the cub to the grass and stepped back. The clearing fell into perfect silence. The cub looked up, let out a small rumble, and took one clumsy step forward. Savannah let out a low, vibrating chuff, the sound lions use to greet those they trust, those they love. The cub answered with a tiny chirp, and then the final steps closed the gap. Savannah licked his head, nudging his small frame close to her chest. She sniffed him, inspecting every inch, then pressed her forehead to his. The tension in her shoulders melted. It was as if the forest exhaled. Ava watched from the porch, tears brimming, then, without thinking. She stepped down. Theo's hand twitched to stop her, but he didn't. She walked slowly across the yard, stopping just beyond the low wire barrier they'd set up weeks ago to keep animals at a safe distance. Savannah saw her, rose to her feet. The cubs remained nestled near the grass. Ava stood still, and Savannah stepped forward, just once, until her face was level with Ava's. Then she leaned in and pressed her nose to the girl's hand through the wire. Ava didn't flinch. Theo watched, heart thudding. And then Ava whispered, clear, steady, and filled with something ancient, "Thank you for waiting." Jillian's eyes widened. She turned toward Theo. She hasn't spoken before. Not like that," Theo said, barely breathing. Ava turned to look at them, eyes bright, cheeks flushed. She stayed for him. She didn't leave. She remembered. And then, the girl who hadn't spoken in years smiled. Savannah returned to her cubs without a sound, lying back down among them. Her mission complete, her place reclaimed. She did not roar, she did not run, but her silence was a song of its own. The forest was golden. The days that followed the reunion passed in a hush of reverence, as if even the trees knew not to break the stillness. Light filtered through the thinning canopy in soft ribbons, catching on the dew-covered grass and the slow rise of steam from Theo's morning coffee. There had been no commotion, no dramatic departure, just waiting. Quiet, shared waiting. Savannah had not left. She remained in the clearing for 3 full days, her body curled in the hollow of the same pine-shadowed spot. Her cubs now nursed in peace, their bellies full, their legs growing stronger with each sunrise. She only moved to pace a small circle beneath the trees, keeping the cabin in sight, as if anchoring herself to something unspoken. Theo watched her from the porch each morning, wrapped in his old canvas jacket, the one with the stitched nameplate from his wild river days. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to, in Savannah's presence. Silence was enough. It was a language older than words. Ava was different now. Since that first moment of contact, when Savannah had touched her hand and she had spoken again, she had not returned to silence. Her voice was still soft, but it was there, like birdsong after a long winter. She spoke of colors again, and wind, and dreams. She asked Theo about his old rescues, about animals he had cared for. She asked about Savannah, how she had been as a cub, what she liked, what made her afraid. In the evenings, she sat on the floor by the fire, sketchpad in her lap, the tip of her pencil dancing across the pages. Each drawing captured more than motion. They held memory. They held soul. On the 3rd night, June Davenport came by. June was a neighbor of sorts, though in these woods neighbor could mean someone who lived 20 miles away. A retired forest ranger in her 60s. June was short and stocky, her white braid falling down her back like a hawk's tail. She had the look of someone who had never learned to whisper and had no desire to try, but her presence had always been a comfort, gruff but loyal. She stepped onto the porch, rubbing her gloved hands together. "Still here?" she asked. Theo nodded, offering her a thermos. "She's guarding something," June muttered, or saying goodbye. "I don't think she's finished," Theo replied, watching the trees. They drank in silence for a while before June added, "This ain't something I've seen before. She's not just wild, she's rooted." Theo nodded again. "So is Ava." On the morning of the 4th day, something shifted. Savannah rose before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, her body taut with a strange kind of calm. Her cubs had already been stirring, pawing at her flanks. One of them, the smallest, the one that had nearly died, ran clumsily toward the tree line, stopping to look back before chirping once. Savannah's ears twitched. Theo stood by the window, holding a mug that had long since gone cold. Ava was beside him, still in her pajama pants and an oversized hoodie, holding the sketchpad to her chest like a sacred text. They both knew. It was time. They stepped out quietly, watching as Savannah nosed each cub toward the woods. Her gait was slow but steady, dignified in a way that made her seem older than her years. The forest received her like an old friend returning home. But she did not go immediately, at the edge of the trees. She paused, her head turned, her golden eyes locked with Ava's. Ava stepped forward, still clutching her sketchbook. Her breath hitched. Savannah let out a deep, resonant chuff, not a warning, not a farewell, a blessing. Ava raised one hand. "Goodbye," she whispered. And then Savannah turned, one final time, and vanished into the trees. The clearing was empty, but it didn't feel like loss. It felt like something had been restored. In the weeks that followed, Ava asked Theo a question that stopped him cold. What if there were others like her, she asked? Others who didn't know where to go. Theo didn't have an answer at first. But 3 months later, construction began on the edge of their property. It started with a fence, then a small barn, then a repurposed field station. Ava helped paint the wooden sign herself, carving each letter slowly, carefully, in bold green strokes. Savannah's refuge. The sanctuary wasn't large, but it didn't need to be. What it held was more than space. It held memory, a space for animals wounded by the world to rest, and perhaps a space for people, too. Their first rescues were small, a fox with a broken paw, a raven with a shattered wing. Ava gave each one a name, and with each new resident, she added a page to her sketchbook. She spoke freely now, still softly, still with care, but the words came like the river in spring, steady, full of life. Sometimes, at dusk, she and Theo would sit on the porch with tea and stories. She would pull out her drawings and point to one. "Do you think she'll ever come back?" Theo would smile. "I don't know, but I think she knows we're here." And deep in the trees, far from the reach of roads and phones, a golden shadow might pause beneath a high ridge, her cubs now strong and wild, her eyes scanning the wind. She would listen and remember sometimes. The forest remembers what we forget, that love, once given freely, never truly disappears. It returns when we least expect it, in the form of a roar, a touch, a memory that refuses to fade. Savannah's journey was not just a mother's instinct, it was a miracle, a whisper from God reminding us that trust, healing, and second chances are all part of His divine plan in our own lives. We often face seasons of silence, fear, or loss, times when we feel forgotten or broken, but like Ava, who found her voice again through the unspoken bond with a lioness, and like Theo, who witnessed the return of a soul he once saved, we are reminded that no act of love is ever wasted. Even in the wildest places, God sees, God remembers, and sometimes He sends us a roar to remind us that we are not alone. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment below if you believe in miracles. Type Amen if you trust that God still moves, even in the silence, even in the forest. And if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel for more stories of love, redemption, and the quiet miracles that change lives. May God bless you and all those you hold dear.